You're listening to the Valley Current.
So it's the summer of 2026.
Yeah.
And the war in Ukraine has literally now lasted longer than the entirety of World War I.
Which is just, it's staggering to even think about.
It really is. And suddenly we're seeing these reports of black, oil rain falling on the suburbs of Moscow.
Right.
And of course, the headlines everywhere are just screaming that Vladimir Putin's regime is, in total collapse.
Naturally, yeah. The media loves a collapse narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But today, we want to look at the cold, hard game theory of all this. To ask you, the listener, is he actually collapsing? Or is he just preparing to kind of flip the entire board?
Right, which is a very different scenario.
Completely. So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to cut straight through all that noise, the breathless commentary, the partisan cheerleading, all of it.
Yeah, we're leaving all the politics at the door today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're examining this highly detailed, just meticulously researched document. It's a special geopolitics and decision theory briefing.
From Computer Law Group LLP, right, or CLG.
Exactly, CLG. This is their updated Summer 2026 standalone assessment. It was spearheaded by Jack Russo, and it approaches this massive global crisis through a really rigorous, mathematical lens.
Right. And, to do this properly, we really need to establish the ground rules for the next hour or so.
Let's hear them.
So in this deep dive, you and I are operating strictly as impartial analysts. We're setting aside any moral judgments or political endorsements.
Right. No taking sides here.
Exactly. Our focus is exclusively on the data, the signaling mechanisms, and the strategic payoffs that are laid out in the CLG briefing.
Because the goal is to actually apply game theory to decode what's happening on the geopolitical chessboard, right?
Right. To determine if the Russian state is actually experiencing a terminal structural failure, like the headlines say, or if the strategic matrix is just, shifting into a new, highly volatile phase.
Which means we have to start with the physical reality on the ground. Because the scale of what happened in late June 2026 is it's driving this entire conversation.
Yeah, the physical events are the catalyst for all the theory we're going to talk about.
So on June 18th, Ukraine launches this absolutely unprecedented drone swarm directly at Moscow.
Right.
The mayor's office there reports, I think it was 194 drones down just on the approach.
Which is an enormous number, but then it gets worse.
Yeah, 8 days later, June 26th, the Russian Defense Ministry announces they intercepted 660 drones across multiple regions.
And they weren't just flying around randomly, they were specifically targeting infrastructure.
Right. Most notably, the Gazprom neft refinery at Kapotnya.
Yeah, Kapotnya.
Which is, get this, a mere 15 kilometers from the Kremlin walls.
That's practically next door in terms of, strategic geography.
Right. And it supplies up to 40% of the Moscow region's fuel. And it's set on fire twice in a single week.
Yeah, forcing them to ground, over 170 flights?
Something like that, yeah. And then you have this really visceral, almost dystopian detail coming out.
The oil rain.
Yes. Residents literally reporting unburned hydrocarbon residue, basically black oil rain just falling on their houses and cars.
Yeah. It's a potent visual, but we have to immediately separate that psychological spectacle from the underlying strategic mechanics.
Right, because a visual isn't a strategy.
Exactly. The spectacle is empirically verified. The drone swarms, the fires, they're real events. But a burning refinery near the capital does not inherently equal systemic collapse.
Okay, so how does the briefing actually model this then?
Well, to understand the actual shift in the payoff matrix, the briefing introduces this highly disciplined analogy. It maps out the economic strain.
Okay, I'm with you.
So imagine the Russian war economy as this vast reservoir.
Right.
The capacity of that reservoir to fund a multi-year, high-attrition conflict relies almost entirely on a single intake pipe.
Which is hydrocarbon revenue.
Oil gas, exactly. And the current situation is described mechanically in the text as 2 taps on the same pipe.
Oh, I like that. 2 taps on the same pipe. Let's break down those 2 taps, starting with the physical supply side.
Right. Tap 1.
Because the Ukrainian drone campaign isn't just about blowing things up for the cameras. It's a really calculated effort to physically dent that pipe.
Yeah, it's highly targeted.
By hitting refineries, rather than just crude extraction sites, Ukraine is fundamentally altering Russia's industrial output. I mean, you can't fuel a T-90 tank with unrefined crude oil.
No, definitely not. Nor an aviation regiment. You need specific distillates.
Yeah.
Diesel, aviation fuel, high-octane gasoline.
And the mechanical vulnerability of a refinery is what makes this strategy so mathematically asymmetric, right?
Exactly, because a modern refinery is this highly complex, really fragile ecosystem. It's full of pressurized vessels, distillation columns, catalytic crackers.
So it's not just a big middle bucket of oil.
Far from it.
Okay.
When a drone strikes a primary crude distillation unit, a CDU, it doesn't just halt production. It creates a massive industrial bottleneck.
And a bottleneck that's really hard to fix right now because of the sanctions.
Precisely. Russia relied heavily on Western engineering for these facilities. Companies like Honeywell, Siemens, UOP.
Right, they built all the specialized valves, the sensors, the compressor turbines.
Yeah. So it's not a matter of just, welding some steel over a hole in a tank.
Right, if a specialized logic controller gets vaporized, Russia can't just order a new one from a factory in the Urals.
No, they have to rely on these really complex, slow, expensive gray market smuggling networks.
Which means a facility that might take, say, 3 weeks to repair in peacetime could be offline for 6 months now.
Exactly. And the International Energy Agency assesses that this specific campaign has knocked more than 20% of Russia's primary refining capacity offline.
20%. That is a huge constriction of the physical supply of usable fuel.
It is. But then TAP 2 compounds that constriction.
Okay, so TAP 1 is denting the pipe. What's TAP 2?
TAP 2 is attacking the financial yield of whatever fuel they do actually manage to produce.
Yeah.
It acts as a sudden drop in the water pressure itself. Ah, okay. So even if the pipe wasn't dented, less water's flowing anyway.
Right. And to understand this, the briefing forces us to look beyond the European theater. We have to examine the macroeconomic shifts in the Middle East.
Because everything is connected.
Exactly. Over the preceding months, the threat of a wider regional war involving Iran had created this massive risk premium in the global energy markets.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz, that's the transit choke point for, roughly a fifth of the world's oil consumption?
Yep, and it was under constant threat. So during that period of elevated risk, the United States issued waivers.
Basically allowing Russian oil to flow more freely, just to prevent a catastrophic spike in global energy costs.
Right. Yeah. And the Financial Times estimated that this dynamic, which the briefing calls the Hormuz dividend.
Oh, the Hormuz dividend. That's a great term.
Yeah, it provided Moscow with an estimated extra $150 million a day in revenue.
A day. Wow. That is a massive financial buffer for a war economy.
But then by the summer of 2026, a fragile ceasefire with Iran takes hold.
The Strait of Hormuz stabilizes, the global panic subsides, the risk premium evaporates, and Brent crude oil plunges.
From its peak of roughly, $120 a barrel?
Yeah.
Down to about $76 a barrel?
Exactly.
Right.
And the mathematics of that price drop are just devastating for the Russian treasury.
Because they don't sell at the Brent price, do they?
No, Russia sells its Urals blend at a discount to Brent crude. So when Brent was at $120, even with a $20 discount, Russia was clearing $100 a barrel.
Which easily funds their military apparatus.
Right. But when Brent drops to $76, that same discount pushes Russian crude close to or even below the G7 price cap.
Wow. So it severely compresses their profit margins.
Exactly. So this convergence of the two taps a 20% reduction in refining capacity, coupled with a 35% drop in the global benchmark price. It constitutes a verifiable multi-vector economic shock.
Okay, so that economic shock is the foundational reality of the board right now.
Right.
But the briefing pivots to how that physical damage is being weaponized psychologically. Because knocking out a distillation column is, an industrial tactic.
Yeah.
But causing fuel shortages that lead to miles-long queues at Lukoil stations in Moscow.
Yeah, and forcing ordinary citizens to witness black oil rain.
Exactly. That is a psychological operation. And President Zelensky has been completely transparent about this. He's explicitly branded these strikes as a 40-day influence operation.
Right. He coined the term long-range sanctions.
Yeah, long-range sanctions.
And that framing is a brilliant piece of strategic communication because traditional economic sanctions are, they're often invisible to the average citizen.
Right, until inflation slowly erodes their purchasing power months later.
Exactly. But Zelensky's objective here is to manufacture immediate, inescapable physical friction.
The goal is to ensure the aggressor cannot maintain the illusion that the war is geographically contained, like somewhere over there.
Right. Because when a conflict drags on for years, the domestic population of the invading nation invariably normalizes the violence.
As long as their daily routines remain uninterrupted.
Precisely. And Ukraine is actively dismantling that normalization.
So to analyze the efficacy of this strategy, The CLG briefing applies this concept from Robert Putnam, the two-level game theory.
Ah, yes. Putnam's framework is crucial here.
Yeah, can you explain that for the listener?
Sure. So Putnam argues that national leaders are never simply playing a single game on the international stage.
Right.
They are locked into two simultaneous interlocking games. Level 1 is the international board. So Putin fighting Ukraine and bargaining with NATO.
And level 2.
Level 2 is the domestic board, where Putin must continuously negotiate with his own oligarchs, the military apparatus, and the general public.
Right. And the critical concept in that model is the domestic win set, right?
Exactly. A leader's win set is basically the range of international agreements or military strategies that would actually be acceptable to their domestic constituencies.
So if a strategy falls outside that win set, the leader risks internal rebellion or just losing power.
Right. And Ukraine's relentless drone campaign is a calculated mathematical attempt to artificially shrink Putin's domestic win set.
By forcing the war into the daily lives of Muscovites.
Yeah.
Through closed airports, air raid sirens, fuel rationing.
Kyiv is trying to raise the domestic political cost of continuing the conflict to a completely unsustainable level.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here, though, because I have to challenge the assumed outcome of shrinking that win set.
Okay, go ahead.
Because the history of strategic bombing campaigns presents a massive contradiction here.
You're thinking of World War II.
Exactly. If a foreign power launches hundreds of drones at your capital city, forcing you to seek shelter, destroying your livelihood.
Historical precedent suggests it often hardens resolve rather than breaking it.
Right. Look at the Blitz in London or the Allied bombing of Germany. It frequently triggers a rally around the flag effect. So how can we be certain this perception war forces Putin to the negotiating table instead of just making the average Russian citizen demand a more brutal retaliation?
Well, the briefing doesn't offer certainty on that point. In fact, it explicitly highlights the divergence of those two potential feedback loops.
Okay, so it models both.
Yes. The model outlines path 1, where the pressure actually achieves its intended effect.
Meaning the collapse.
Right. The cost of domestic disruption exceeds the regime's capacity to suppress it. The social contract of, compliance in exchange for stability fractures.
And Putin is forced to seek an off-ramp just to preserve his own internal power.
Exactly. In that scenario, the shrinking win set forces a concession, but path 2 is the exact inverse.
The rally around the flag.
Yes. The regime successfully weaponizes the attacks. The Kremlin's media apparatus frames the drone swarms not as the consequence of a failed invasion,
but as proof of an existential threat.
Right. The narrative shifts to NATO and the West are trying to destroy the Russian homeland. The humiliation is alchemized into nationalistic fervor.
And then the domestic win set actually expands. They're willing to tolerate higher casualties.
And the regime gains the political capital to escalate even further. Both of these pathways are logically consistent within the framework of game theory.
Okay, so how do we know which paths we're actually on?
Well, to determine which pathway the system is currently tracking toward, we have to perform a really rigorous analysis of the Kremlin's public communications.
Right.
We have to evaluate how the regime is attempting to manage this new variable. Which brings us to June 28th, 2026.
Oh, man. This speech.
Yeah. Vladimir Putin engaged in a piece of public signaling that deviated drastically from his behavior over the prior 5 years of the conflict.
He actually went on national television and admitted that the strikes were hurting them.
Yes. During a Sunday broadcast, the man who has spent decades cultivating an aura of absolute invulnerability publicly conceded the existence of a fuel deficit.
He stated, and this is a direct quote, "These strikes on our infrastructure sites are creating problems. That's obvious."
Which is wild. Why does an autocratic leader, whose authority rests entirely on the projection of absolute control, voluntarily admit to a vulnerability on state television?
Right. Through the lens of signaling theory, that broadcast wasn't just a moment of weakness, was it?
No, not at all. It was a highly sophisticated exercise in audience cost management.
Because a public statement by a head of state, especially in a constrained information environment, is rarely just a simple transmission of facts.
It's a multi-layered signal. It's designed to manage the expectations and behaviors of several distinct audiences all at the same time.
It reminds me of how a CEO handles a disastrous quarterly earnings call.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Right. Because if a company misses its revenue targets by a massive margin, and everyone on Wall Street knows it.
The CEO can't get on the call and pretend everything is fine.
Exactly. If they deny the obvious reality, They lose all credibility with the shareholders, and the stock tanks even harder.
They have to acknowledge the pain to prove they are still connected to reality.
And then immediately pivot to how they are managing it.
Right. And that corporate analogy maps perfectly onto the political reality here.
Because he had multiple audiences.
Yes. The first audience was the domestic public. The drone strikes and fuel queues in Moscow were observable phenomena.
People could see them out their window.
Exactly. Denying them would have created a catastrophic cognitive dissonance for the Russian public. It would erode the state's monopoly on truth.
So by acknowledging the obvious problems, Putin preserved his credibility.
Yes. But he instantly transitioned to his second audience, the domestic economic markets and the bureaucratic elite.
Right.
He bracketed the concession by claiming the decline in gasoline reserves was only 4% and insisted the situation was not critical.
He acknowledged the damage to maintain credibility, then minimized the scope to prevent systemic panic.
Precisely. But he didn't stop there.
No, there was a third audience. Kyiv and the Western capitals.
Right. Because after minimizing the domestic impact, he drew a hard line on the international board.
He explicitly vowed that the offensive operations in Ukraine would continue undeterred,
asserting that the fuel logistical issues had no effect on the situation at the front.
And he also publicly disclosed, and then subsequently rejected, a Ukrainian proposal for a mutual moratorium on long-range infrastructure strikes.
Right. He characterized their offer as a tactical ruse designed to save the Kyiv regime.
Rejecting that moratorium was a really critical signaling move, wasn't it?
Absolutely. In game theory, it functions as a demonstration of resolve.
By refusing to trade away his own deep strike capabilities just to protect his capital.
He is signaling to Kyiv that their long-range sanctions have not altered his underlying payoff matrix enough to force a concession.
He's attempting to prove that his threshold for pain is higher than their capacity to inflict it.
Exactly. But the final layer of that broadcast is perhaps the most dangerous.
Right, because while rejecting the moratorium, he actively expanded the theoretical boundaries of the conflict. He invoked Novorossiya.
Yeah, Novorossiya, which is not just a rhetorical flourish.
No. For the listener who might not know, New Russia is this Tsarist-era imperial concept. It claims a massive swath of southern and eastern Ukraine, extending all the way across the Black Sea coast to Odessa.
Right, and by reintroducing that specific terminology into the public discourse, he is moving the goalposts entirely.
Okay, but why? What purpose does that serve?
It serves a dual purpose.
Yeah.
Analytically, it can be interpreted as a genuine expansion of war aims.
Signaling that the regime believes it possesses the long-term attritional advantage to conquer significantly more territory.
Right. Or, alternatively, in the context of bargaining theory, it acts as an extreme anchoring mechanism.
Okay, anchoring. How does that work here?
If the regime anticipates that the economic strain might eventually force them to the negotiating table, establishing an outrageous maximalist demand sets the initial parameters of the negotiation.
Oh, I see. It allows them to later concede territory they never actually held in the first place in exchange for keeping the territory they do control.
Exactly. It's a classic negotiation tactic.
But the briefing emphasizes that every single component of this signaling strategy can be interpreted in two completely divergent ways, right?
Yes. A leader admitting pain, rejecting ceasefires, and expanding demands.
Could be projecting the supreme confidence of a regime that knows it's winning the war of attrition.
Or it could be the desperate, overcompensated posturing of a regime that is quietly terrifying its own elites as the economy buckles under the weight of the drone campaign.
And this inherent ambiguity is further compounded by the dispute over the actual physical damage.
Right, the informational chasm.
Because Putin assured his domestic audience that the fuel reserve deficit was merely 4%.
While simultaneously, President Zelensky asserted to his Western allies that 40% of Russia's primary refining capacity had been taken offline.
4% versus 40%. That is a massive gap.
It is, and the briefing cautions against accepting either figure at face value. Both actors are operating under diametrically opposed incentive structures.
Right, because Putin's incentive is to project stability, to prevent capital flight and domestic unrest.
And Zelensky's incentive is to demonstrate a massive return on investment to the NATO coalition, to ensure the continued flow of advanced weaponry.
But the gap between 4% and 40% isn't just a matter of political spin, is it?
No, it's also a reflection of the profound difficulty in conducting accurate bomb damage assessment, or BDA, in a denied environment.
Yeah, let's talk about BDA. Because how do we actually know what's broken?
Well, open source intelligence relies heavily on commercial satellite imagery. specifically synthetic aperture radar and thermal imaging.
Right.
When a drone strikes a facility, analysts can confirm a fire occurred, and they can estimate the structural damage to a specific unit.
But determining the precise duration of the operational outage is highly speculative.
Extremely speculative. As we discussed earlier, if a strike merely damages a secondary pipeline, the facility might resume partial production in a matter of days.
But if it destroys a bespoke Western compressor, that unit could be offline indefinitely.
Exactly. Furthermore, the metrics themselves are deliberately misaligned.
What do you mean?
Look at what they're actually saying. Putin cited a 4% dip in overall national fuel reserves. That's a buffered metric that includes stored inventory. Zelensky cited a 40% disruption in active primary refining capacity.
Wow. So both statements can be technically true while painting entirely contradictory pictures of the strategic reality. Okay, so let's summarize the board state here. We have a battlefield defined by conflicting damage assessments.
Right.
A leader sending intentionally ambiguous signals to 4 different audiences. A global oil market experiencing wild price swings. And a domestic population whose breaking point is entirely unknown.
It's a system defined by extreme volatility.
And this convergence of volatility basically breaks the models of classical game theory, doesn't it?
Yes. The rules aren't just changing, the fundamental parameters of the game are dissolving.
Which the briefing diagnoses as a Nash Disequilibrium.
Yes, the Nash Disequilibrium, which is really the intellectual core of the CLG analysis.
So I hear Nash and I think of like beautiful mind, John Nash. But what does a Nash disequilibrium actually mean for the listener?
Well, to grasp its significance, we must first define the baseline, a Nash equilibrium, which is a foundational concept in non-cooperative game theory. It describes a steady state within a system.
Like when things settle down.
Exactly. It occurs when every player has chosen a strategy, and no player can achieve a better outcome by unilaterally changing their strategy, assuming the other player's strategies remain constant.
It is a state of mutual, optimized stagnation.
Right. In simpler systems, once players discover the optimal countermoves to each other, the game settles into a predictable pattern.
The strategic choices become fixed, and the payoffs for those choices remain continuous and reliable.
Exactly. The critical prerequisite for any system to achieve a Nash equilibrium is stability in the rules and the payoff matrix.
Okay.
If we consider a repeated game, an equilibrium can only form if the stage game, the individual round being played, remains structurally identical turn after turn.
But that is the exact opposite of what's happening here.
Right. A Nash disequilibrium occurs when the environment surrounding the game alters the payoff matrix at a velocity that exceeds the player's ability to calculate and deploy new optimal strategies.
The board is being violently shaken while the pieces are still moving.
That's a great way to visualize it. I mean, look at just a single week in June 2026. The entire architecture of the conflict experienced massive external shocks.
The Iranian crisis resolved, dropping global oil prices by nearly 40%.
The largest drone swarms in the history of warfare penetrated the airspace of a nuclear superpower.
And the G7 and the United States simultaneously threatened the implementation of secondary sanctions targeting foreign banks processing Russian transactions.
Oh, right. The calculus required to formulate a best response is changing literally hourly.
So the result is a system characterized by radical unpredictability.
Yes. The players are forced to constantly abandon their strategies halfway through execution because the environment that justified the strategy no longer exists.
However, the briefing makes a crucial analytical distinction here, one that directly counters those breathless media narratives about imminent collapse.
Yes. The presence of a Nash disequilibrium implies the system is in violent motion. But it does not inherently guarantee that the Russian regime is undergoing a structural collapse.
Moving versus collapsing, that's a huge distinction.
Huge. And the briefing maps this disequilibrium across 3 distinct strategic vectors to isolate the signal from the noise.
Okay, let's walk through those vectors. The first vector is economic and external.
Right. This encompasses the physical destruction of the refineries, the evaporation of the Hormuz dividend, and the tightening noose of secondary sanctions on the financial sector.
And the data overwhelmingly confirms that this specific vector has shifted decisively against Moscow.
Yes. The economic attrition rate has visibly accelerated.
Okay, so that's vector 1. Vector 2 is internal cohesion.
Yes. This measures the stability of the elite coalition that keeps Putin in power.
And during this period of extreme volatility, we saw a cascade of minor events that generated intense speculation about internal fragmentation.
Right. For example, a 73-year-old former defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, passed away from an undisclosed illness.
And a video surfaced of a disgruntled Russian veteran named Lunin sharply criticizing the military leadership.
And Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus engaged in some diplomatic maneuvering that appeared slightly misaligned with Moscow's stated objectives.
And the Western narrative immediately seized on these events as evidence of a fracturing state. Like, this is it, the end is here.
Right.
But I want to challenge the briefing's rapid dismissal of these data points.
Yeah.
Because in the study of regime collapse, doesn't the end usually begin with a series of seemingly disconnected anomalies?
That's a fair question.
Like in cooperative game theory, there's the concept of the empty core, right?
Yes. A situation where no possible distribution of resources can satisfy all the necessary coalition partners, leading to the collapse of the alliance.
Exactly. So if the economic vector is shrinking the available resources, the pie is getting smaller, shouldn't we view the death of an oligarch, military dissent, and allied hedging as the early indicators of an empty core scenario?
It's a compelling counterargument. But the CLG briefing relies on a strict empirical evidentiary standard. The theory of the empty core requires a systemic failure to distribute rent. But Putin's regime is structured as a deeply entrenched patronage-based autocracy.
Right.
The security services and the economic elite are bound to the regime not by ideological alignment, but by complicity and the threat of severe repression.
So they're stuck.
Right. The death of a retired official, a single recanted video from a low-ranking veteran, and the standard risk-hedging behavior of a client state like Belarus.
They don't meet the empirical threshold required to prove that the patronage networks have actually failed.
Exactly. While the economic pie is shrinking, there is no verified data to suggest the internal mechanism for distributing the remaining slices has broken down.
So the briefing concludes that the internal cohesion vector remains fundamentally static.
Yes. Economic deterioration combined with internal stasis.
Which brings us to the third vector, escalation. And this is where the disequilibrium generates the most profound systemic risk.
Absolutely. The theory posits that when an autocratic regime experiences massive external pressure and suffers highly visible humiliations in its own capital,
the payoff matrix for escalation drastically alters.
The calculus shifts toward greater violence. The pressure exerted by the Ukrainian strikes, which is designed to force a negotiation, acts simultaneously as a catalyst for a disproportionate kinetic response.
Because the regime perceives an imperative to demonstrate to its domestic audience and its adversaries that it retains absolute escalation dominance.
Exactly. And to understand the scale of the forces driving this escalation, we have to recognize that the localized conflict in Ukraine is inextricably bound to a much larger geopolitical architecture.
Yeah, let's pull the lens all the way back here, because a seemingly minor detail from Putin's June 28 broadcast suddenly illuminates this entire interconnected structure.
Right, the reference to the peace envoys.
Yes. While discussing drone strikes and fuel deficits, Putin abruptly introduced the United States into the equation.
He stated that he expected American peace envoys, specifically naming Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to arrive in Moscow.
But he appended a highly specific condition to their arrival. He said, once the ceasefire in the Middle East, war takes hold.
And that single conditional clause reveals the macro-strategic reality.
Because the Kremlin operates on the premise that the various theaters of global conflict are completely integrated.
Exactly. The briefing constructs a model of 3 concentric rings of conflict that are currently dominating the international system.
Okay, let's break down these 3 rings. At the absolute center is the hot war.
Right. The grinding, high-intensity conventional conflict between Russia and Ukraine, characterized by massive attrition and direct territorial contestation.
Okay, and surrounding that is the warm war.
Yes. The multifaceted conflict between the United States and Iran, fought through proxy militias, naval deployments, and targeted strikes, which is currently paused by a highly fragile ceasefire in the Gulf.
And encompassing all of this is the Cold War.
The overarching strategic competition between the United States and China, primarily focused on the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, and technological dominance through semiconductor export controls.
Hot, warm, cold.
Exactly. And the critical insight here is the instantaneous transmission of friction between these rings.
A disruption in one theater immediately forces a recalculation in the others.
Always. We can trace the precise mechanics of this coupling by analyzing the downstream effects of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire.
Right, because when the warm war de-escalated, the immediate effect was a reduction in the threat to maritime shipping in the Strait of Hormuz.
And as we discussed, the reduction in maritime risk immediately suppressed the global price of oil,
which evaporated the Hormuz dividend, severely degrading the Russian war economy in the hot war theater.
But the coupling extends beyond economics into strategic bandwidth.
Oh, this is fascinating. Explain that.
Well, while the Middle East was on the brink of regional war, the diplomatic, intelligence, and military resources of the United States were heavily concentrated on containing Iran.
Right, they were distracted.
Exactly. The ceasefire freed up an immense amount of American strategic bandwidth. The U.S. administration suddenly possessed the diplomatic capital and the operational focus to pivot back toward the European theater.
They could dedicate their full attention to managing the Ukrainian crisis, tightening secondary sanctions, coordinating with NATO allies.
Right. So from the perspective of the Kremlin, peace in the Middle East translates directly into intensified pressure on the Ukrainian front.
It is a perfectly correlated risk environment. You cannot accurately model the outcome in Ukraine without simultaneously modeling the variables in Iran.
You really can't.
And this intense interconnectivity forces us to examine the behavior of the broader international community, too, specifically the BRICS nations.
Ah, yes. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the newer members like Iran.
Because the dominant geopolitical narrative often portrays BRICS as this monolithic, anti-Western coalition preparing to overturn the global order. But how does the pressure of these three concentric wars actually affect the cohesion of this bloc?
Well, the briefing provides a highly nuanced assessment here. It demonstrates that the different rings of conflict exert opposing pressures on the BRICS coalition.
Opposing pressures.
Yes. The hot war at the center functions as a powerful unifier, primarily through economic necessity.
Because of the sanctions.
Right. The comprehensive Western sanctions regime targeting Russia has created an overwhelming incentive for Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi to collaborate on developing alternative financial architectures.
They are essentially forced to build a parallel plumbing system for the global economy just to bypass the US dollar and the SWIFT messaging network.
Exactly. This results in the expansion of bilateral currency swaps and alternative clearinghouses, pulling the bloc closer together economically.
But then, what about the other rings?
The dynamics of the Cold War on the outer ring generate powerful centrifugal forces that pull the bloc apart strategically.
Okay, give me an example.
The overarching tension between the U.S. and China over Taiwan and Indo-Pacific dominance forces middle powers within BRICS to engage in complex hedging strategies.
India is the prime example of this fracture, right?
Yes, exactly. While India is perfectly willing to leverage the hot war to purchase deeply discounted Russian crude oil in non-dollar currencies.
They are simultaneously deeply anxious about Chinese expansionism in their own hemisphere.
Right. They perceive the Cold War dynamic as a direct threat to their national security.
Consequently, they are aggressively deepening their defense partnerships with the United States and participating in the Quad Alliance explicitly to counterbalance Beijing.
So the hot war drives economic integration, but the Cold War prevents the formation of a unified military or strategic alliance.
Wow. The board is infinitely complex. We have a Russian state facing severe economic constriction, an unpredictable domestic windset, a volatile global energy market, and a fractured network of international alliances.
The Nash Disequilibrium is accelerating, making optimal strategies impossible to calculate.
And when a nuclear-armed power is subjected to this level of correlated multi-theater pressure, we are forced to confront the darkest, most terrifying variable in the entire matrix.
We must examine the mechanics of the retaliation.
Yeah. The briefing forces us to analyze the events of July 2nd, the period described as Kyiv's longest night.
It was brutal.
The Russian response to the Moscow drone swarms was an overwhelming demonstration of conventional escalation dominance. They launched massive waves of Oreshnik, hypersonic, and ballistic missiles at the Ukrainian capital.
And the targeting was indiscriminate. A children's hospital was struck. A multi-story residential complex was partially destroyed.
And secondary strikes targeted first responders arriving at the scenes.
But the briefing identifies a grim, tactical reality beneath the carnage. The Russian military was systematically exploiting Ukraine's depleted inventory of Patriot missile interceptors.
This is the brutal mathematics of the tit-for-tat dynamic operating at the extremes of the escalation ladder.
Right. Ukraine demonstrated the capacity to inflict psychological and economic friction within the Russian capital.
And Russia responded by demonstrating that it retains the absolute capacity to inflict structural devastation on the Ukrainian capital.
The mechanics of the interception battle are crucial here. The Patriot system is highly effective, but its magazines are finite.
And the interceptor missiles are incredibly expensive and slow to manufacture.
Exactly. So the Russian strategy involves saturating the airspace with cheap drones and cruise missiles to exhaust the Patriot batteries.
And then launching the Oreshnik missiles.
Right. And the Oreshnik is a hypersonic ballistic system. Once its glide vehicle re-enters the atmosphere, it travels at velocities that leave defending radars and interceptors only seconds to establish a firing solution.
So if the batteries are already depleted by the saturation wave, the hypersonic weapons strike their targets with near impunity.
Exactly. And the deployment of the Oreshnik introduces the ultimate strategic threshold.
Because it's a dual-capable system, right?
Yes. It has been used repeatedly in this conflict to deliver conventional payloads. However, its primary design function is the delivery of a nuclear warhead.
Which forces the briefing to address the most critical question of the entire conflict. If the regime perceives that the convergence of economic ruin and domestic instability poses an existential threat to its survival, what is the probability that Putin authorizes the use of a tactical nuclear weapon against Kyiv?
It's the question everyone is afraid to ask, but the briefing approaches it with absolute empirical rigor. It entirely avoids speculative modeling or alarmist rhetoric.
Right. It relies on the baseline institutional assessments.
Yes. It emphasizes that every major institutional intelligence assessment, ranging from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency to premier European think tanks, continues to rate the probability of nuclear use as low.
Low, but mathematically non-zero.
Exactly. And the uncertainty stems from the deliberate ambiguity built into the updated Russian nuclear doctrine of late 2024, which relies on highly subjective thresholds for employment.
Furthermore, historical analysis by organizations like the German Council on Foreign Relations demonstrates a clear correlation, doesn't it?
It does. Russian nuclear signaling and the posturing of strategic forces demonstrably intensify following significant conventional setbacks or periods of intense regime vulnerability.
Okay, so to evaluate the actual constraints on nuclear use, the briefing analyzes two specific historical precedents.
Right.
The first is the use of atomic weapons by the United States against Japan in 1945. But it uses 1945 not as a parallel, but as a demonstration of a completely inverted strategic matrix.
Exactly. In 1945, President Truman operated with a global monopoly on nuclear technology.
Right, nobody else had the bomb.
And the strategic objective was the rapid termination of a massive multi-theater conflict. And crucially, the risk of a retaliatory nuclear strike against the American homeland was absolutely zero.
Because there's no mutually assured destruction yet.
Right. But in 2026, the strategic architecture is defined by mutually assured destruction. Breaking the 80-year nuclear taboo today would instantly trigger a cascade of catastrophic consequences.
NATO has repeatedly and publicly articulated that any nuclear use would result in a devastating conventional response.
Furthermore, it would instantly sever Russia's remaining geopolitical lifelines. Both China and India have been unequivocal in their opposition to the use of nuclear weapons.
A strike would transform Russia from an embattled state into a complete global pariah, destroying the very alternative economic plumbing they are trying to build with bricks.
Exactly. And the second empirical anchor the briefing relies upon is a localized meteorological precedent.
Right, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, which introduces the game-theoretic nightmare of uncontrollable externalities.
The briefing summarizes the deterrent effect of fallout with a chillingly simple phrase: the wind does not check passports.
That line really stuck with me, because the physical reality of a nuclear detonation over a city like Kyiv means generating a massive radioactive plume.
And the trajectory of that fallout is entirely dependent on the prevailing weather patterns at the exact moment of detonation.
If the winds are blowing west, the fallout drifts over the Polish border, contaminating NATO territory and potentially triggering an Article 5 collective defense response.
If the winds blow south, it irradiates the Black Sea agricultural basin, devastating global food supplies.
And if the winds blow north or east, the regime risks dumping lethal radiation directly onto its primary ally, Belarus, or straight back into its own sovereign territory.
The weapon possesses an inherent environmental indifference that makes its tactical utility almost impossible to calculate. It is a weapon of profound self-harm.
So, to map out the sequence of events following a theoretical detonation, the briefing utilizes the escalation ladder framework developed by Herman Kahn, the pioneering nuclear strategist.
Yes. If the taboo is broken, Kahn's model outlines two primary branches for the international system's reaction.
Let's start with Branch 1, containment.
Right. In Branch 1, the international community, led by NATO, responds not with a retaliatory nuclear strike, but with overwhelming, unrestrained conventional military force.
The objective is the total physical dismantling of Russian power projection capabilities outside its borders.
The Black Sea Fleet is sunk, air defense networks are shattered, and Russian ground forces in Ukraine are systematically decimated from the air.
Simultaneously, a total hermetic seal is placed on the Russian economy. The regime is forced into a coerced settlement, and the state is ruined.
That's Branch 1. But Branch 2 is the spiral.
And that's the one that keeps everyone awake at night.
Yes. The use of a nuclear weapon shatters all existing communication protocols and strategic assumptions.
In the resulting chaos and fog of war, the rapid deployment of NATO conventional forces is misinterpreted by Russian early warning systems as a preemptive decapitation strike.
Panic sets in. Decision-making windows collapse to minutes, and miscalculation leads to further nuclear launches.
This is the pathway to a planetary strategic exchange.
Right. And the game theory is unequivocal here. In both the containment branch and the spiral branch, the leadership that initiates the first strike ends up in a substantially worse position than if they had simply accepted conventional defeat.
The decision to employ the weapon is fundamentally value-destroying for the user.
This is the structural foundation of deterrence.
But this brings us to the ultimate, terrifying paradox that sits at the center of this entire briefing.
The paradox of the win set.
Right. Because all the intelligence assessments, all the game theory matrices, and all the historical precedents conclude that Putin will not authorize a nuclear strike unless he subjectively perceives that his regime is facing an imminent existential threat to its survival.
And that is the trapdoor hidden within the Nash Disequilibrium.
Because generating an existential threat to the Putin regime, compressing his economy, manufacturing intolerable domestic friction, shrinking his political windset until the entire system is paralyzed.
Is the exact stated objective of the long-range sanctions campaign?
The strategy is designed to push the regime to the absolute breaking point to force a capitulation. But the breaking point is the exact threshold where the nuclear doctrine authorizes the launch sequence.
It's a terrifying feedback loop. We are attempting to walk a tightrope over an abyss, and the rope is fraying.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the Nash Disequilibrium. The players are applying maximum pressure within a system where the rules are constantly dissolving.
The environment is moving at breakneck speed. And a single miscalculation regarding the adversary's pain tolerance could precipitate an event that alters the course of human history.
Wow, this has been an incredibly dense, heavy, and frankly, necessary examination of the geopolitical reality in 2026.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But applying rigorous game theory to these events strips away the comforting illusions of the daily news cycle and exposes the raw mechanics of the crisis. Right. Before we conclude, though, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final variable to consider.
The exogenous shock.
Exactly. We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing the known components of the board, refining capacities, signaling theories, drone intercept ratios, and escalation ladders.
We are obsessively tracking the variables we can see.
Right. But if the fundamental nature of a Nash disequilibrium is that the system is changing faster than the players can adapt, what happens when an entirely exogenous shock hits the board?
Something no one is modeling.
Right. What if, tomorrow, there is a sudden exponential leap in artificial intelligence that grants drone swarms total autonomous targeting capabilities, instantly rendering all existing air defense doctrines obsolete?
Or what if a massive seismic event devastates the Taiwan Strait, instantly crippling the global semiconductor supply chain and violently upending the Cold War dynamics we discussed?
We are agonizing over the movements of the pieces currently in play, but the true checkmate, the event that instantly forces a terrifying new reality upon the world, might come from a variable that isn't even on the board yet.
It's a sobering thought.
Led by Jack Russo, Computer Law Group LLP is a bespoke business litigation and founder-friendly boutique law firm with offices and licensed attorneys in Silicon Valley, New York, and Tampa Bay. And you can reach Jack at jack@computerlaw.com and his team at www.computerlaw.com, where the newsletter we referred to is published in detail and readily available, commitment-free, with no paywalls or other charges.
next time on The Valley Current.